Because I'm not telling you shit.
No!
What the hell?
Hold your fire! Lower your weapon.
I look stupid to you?
No. That's why you're gonna point that pistol somewhere else.
Lower your weapon. I'll lower mine.
Not gonna happen. You got a name?
McPherson, First Lieutenant. You?
Walker, Captain. We found your friend at the plane. He told us where to find you.
Really? Where's he at?
He didn't make it.
Why am I not surprised?
So what? You think we killed him?
I didn't say that.
You're not saying much of anything, Lieutenant.
Article 4, Captain. You gotta speak to my commander.
Well, where's he at?
By now, I'd imagine he's just downstairs.
Yeah, I'll bet.
Why don't you wait here? I'll go get him.
Today on Mondays with Mo, we're taking a look at 2012's Spec Ops: The Line. This game has managed to acquire quite the cult following over the last few years. In fact, I think more people are playing Spec Ops: The Line today, here in 2018, 2017, than they ever were back in 2012. Unfortunately, this game sold incredibly poorly. It was unable to make really any money for Take-Two alongside of some of Take-Two's other releases during that time period. In fact, it sold worse alongside of some other releases, I believe Max Payne 3 at the time, than it sold worse than Duke Nukem Forever and LA Noire put together. And that says a lot. I mean, LA Noire sold pretty well, but Duke Nukem Forever, I mean, come on, guys. That's kind of unfortunate. It's sad. I think it does actually say a lot about this style of an experience and what people expect from a shooter, especially a military one, and what you actually get with Spec Ops: The Line. This is a game that very much defies expectation. It is far more than meets the eye. It is the perfect example of don't judge a book by its cover, because on its cover, the book that is Spec Ops: The Line is just another cover-based third-person military shooter with some cool sand effects going on. But once you actually get past the first chapter, like the first hour and a half of the game, you realize it's a lot more. It's a game that forces the player to question their decisions. It's a game that gives the player a lot of freedom in how they answer the questions of those decisions. And it's a game that then gives the player realistic impacts based on the decisions they make. This is a game that is almost entirely about its narrative and how that narrative drives the player experience, which means that it doesn't have the strongest gameplay component. It's not incredibly weak, but it's not that great either. So if you came here for a third-person shooter and great gunplay, great gameplay, you really just didn't get that. I think you got some spectacular environmental design at times, but all in all, it's a pop-and-stop shooter that looks to drive its experience from one point to the next through its narrative, and that experience presented by that narrative more than it ever does with its gameplay. And that's actually intentional. When you look at any of the sort of discussion that the development teams have had with how this game was made and why they made it the way they made it, the creative lead, so on and so forth, almost everything was based around the concept of ensuring that everything else didn't affect the narrative. So when they're designing the audio for the guns, when they're designing the gameplay mechanics, the music, everything, they're thinking, is this going to detract from the player's ability to connect with the narrative? And if so, then we need to tone things back. And that is why I think the gameplay ended up as sort of dry and as dull as it did. Don't get me wrong, there are some instances where they've clearly tried to do some unique things. I think the use of sand to collapse bits and pieces of the terrain and buildings to eliminate enemies, to create new pathways, having to deal with the sand in general, I think is a pretty damn awesome mechanic, and it's something I wish they would have went a little bit more all in on. But it's not like an outstanding and unbelievable part of the experience. And unfortunately, we got to tag two members of the 33rd here, because they're not good guys, man. These are the dudes we came here to rescue. This is the narrative, the disturbing narrative that is Spec Ops: The Line. These dudes are murdering civilians, and we still haven't been given an answer as to why they're doing that. But all we know is they're going to kill us if we don't kill them. The CIA is involved. This whole thing is just gone to shit. And you can really start to see just how and why they were inspired by films like Heart of Darkness and Apocalypse Now, because there's just so much of that oozing from this experience. So let's go ahead and wipe these guys out. You know, I like a good cover-based shooter, but one of the biggest weaknesses of the cover-based shooter is how repetitive and generic the combat can feel, which is why I feel most military cover-based shooters don't end up resulting in anything special. They ultimately feel very pop and stop. Even a game like Uncharted, I think, kind of falls into that realm at times. You know, it's one of the reasons I've always praised Gears of War, because it manages to use manages to use unique monster types, unique enemies, to make the cover shooting aspect of the game a little bit more interesting than it otherwise is. Grenades do a lot of damage in this. We need to wipe this guy out so we can get a heal off on our dude here. There we go. Wipe him out. Let me vault over and heal this guy before he bleeds out. Sorry, Adams. So, I think there's one actually really great way of describing the design decisions that the team made, and that was subtlety. You know, as I mentioned with the audio design and this really big focus on ensuring that nothing detracted from the narrative, the developers wanted to be subtle with everything. That includes the characters themselves, ensuring that the main character is voiced by Nolan North, who voiced pretty much everybody at that point in time in a video game, you know, isn't too well represented actually as a character. While a lot of games present you with the situation where, man, always having to kill these down guys is brutal, where the characters are really well fleshed out. That's kind of how they deliver their experience. You know, you look at Mass Effect, you look at a BioWare game, and they're doing everything they can to ensure that the player understands the characters, their motives, you know, their background. That's how they tell their stories. That's how they build a powerful relationship with the game world, its characters, and its environment with the player. Spec Ops does the opposite of that, and it wants the player to feel almost as just confused and as disturbed as the characters themselves are. So it makes sure that no one individual character is represented to their fullest extent. Instead, you get these characters who seem to be coming on in this rather standard mission, dealing with this, you know, typical situation that quickly becomes very atypical. And that's where the characters start to develop, and as the player, you get to see them develop while they also devolve into madness. And that's the sort of psychological element of this game that unfortunately we won't experience firsthand today. But that was very much an intentional decision by me. I think if this is something that you hear me talk about and you suddenly become interested in, it's the type of game that I don't really want to spoil for anybody. Even this many years on, I feel like there's something really special about experiencing this game's madness firsthand and watching the characters devolve into it. We'll see a little bit of it here today, but that's going to be about it. Let's go ahead and find this last guy here. Oh, there we go. We got more dudes actually making their way in here. I really do think the combat could have been taken up a notch. I know they were really concerned about the combat detracting from the narrative. So instead you end up with sort of this really simplistic joyride, if you will. It's not really joyful. I do think they do a good job of portraying the violence, which was, again, really important to the team. They didn't want it to feel gratuitous. They didn't want it to feel like another action shooter experience. They wanted it to feel, you know, dark and grim, and they wanted the player to constantly question their decisions. They wanted the player to really think about each and every trigger pull, and I think even having played through this game twice now, they've done that, you know? Every time there's a guy like that, I shoot them. Because, I'm sorry, I don't want to walk up and step on their throat to execute them. I don't, man. I just really, really don't. There's just something so grim about that to me. I mean, killing the dude in general is grim, especially considering these are supposed to be, you know, U.S. military. It's supposed to be my brothers in arms here. But I just can never bring myself to do the execution thing, man. And I think that really demonstrates how well they portrayed the violence and the darkness in this game. It's also one of the things that the creative director and the writers talked about being very challenging with this. Writing this game was not easy because they were so head first into that mindset of, you know, trying to really bring home that sort of violence, the horrors of war, without making it cheesy or just action oriented. So I'm gonna go ahead and take these guys out here. Let's actually talk a little bit while we engage in some combat here about the Spec Ops franchise. This is actually the 10th entry in what is a very long-running franchise, dating back to the late 90s. The final entry, I believe, released in 2002. There's like, I mean, there's 9 friggin' games, man. A couple of them were sort of sequels to the sequels. They released a couple games that were like Spec Ops 2, the base game, and then Spec Ops 2, like the second version of it, most of them being on PlayStation 1, and most of them being like pretty mediocre, I think, even for the time. I know a lot of people have good memories of them, but when you consider that like SOCOM would come out very shortly after that, and we had like Siphon Filter, I played the games. I remember distinctly playing Covert Ops actually and enjoying it, but man, they're games that haven't aged well. Let's put it that way. Let's just shoot these dudes in the leg real quick, I guess. See that? Okay, so the explosive barrels. Before we go any further with the history of the game, I want to talk about that because the sand to me in this game was sort of, initially when I started playing it, I remember the first time, the replacement for things like explosive barrels, right? Like, I loved that the sand was there, and it was like, oh, cool, man. It's kind of like, you know, how we've been using explosive barrels in games for ages, and now, instead, we've got sand, and that feels just more realistic, more grounded in this game's reality. But then they throw these, like, explosive ammo caches, and it always killed it for me. I was like, why did they do that? It's just, they didn't need to do it, man. They didn't need to do it. So, back to the franchise as a whole. What would essentially happen, and the way that I've always looked at it, the way that many people have looked at it, is that at some point, Take-Two, owning the rights to the Spec Ops franchise, was probably going to have to forfeit the rights by default because it was inactive or something like that. So they go ahead and make an announcement and potentially actually have a situation where Rockstar is working on the franchise. Eventually that project would be canceled, and it said that they were actually working with some musicians to bring the soundtrack to life and yada yada. The game would never see the day of light of day, the sand of the day, something like that, right? So instead, Jaeger is then contracted and said, okay, well, here's the IP, show us what you can do with it. They originally pitch a futuristic sci-fi cover-based third-person shooter. That gets turned down. It wasn't even going to take place in Dubai, completely different game, right? They go back to the drawing board and they end up coming away with this this idea for a military shooter, again, very grounded in reality, very visceral, you know, really focusing on the horrors of war and taking a lot of inspiration from things like Heart of Darkness and Apocalypse Now, and they go all in on that. The game eventually will see two different sets of writers before they finally settle on Richard Peasy, who actually worked on Section 8, which is, interestingly enough, a sci-fi first-person shooter, and Walt Williams, who worked on BioShock 2 and Mafia 2. Two very, I think, well-written games, and especially when we look at Mafia 2, for those of you guys who haven't played Mafia 2, that is a dark and grim sort of mafiosa storytelling experience. Like, you want to talk about the horrors of the mafia oaths to life, that game nailed it, man. And I think, you know, it was that writing experience that very much translates to a lot of what we see here with this game, and I think that was a really powerful choice for them in terms of picking the narrative. But it's so much more than just the writing with this game. You know, I really want to stress again, as we talked about earlier on, how much the overarching experience has to actually do. I'm gonna say we need to save this for the helicopter. The overarching experience actually has to do with how that narrative is portrayed. It's just really well executed by the whole team. It's unfortunate that we'll never see another game, but the reality is it sold, as I mentioned, incredibly poorly. And I think, you know, a lot of people will say that people don't want to play a game like this, and I think to some extent that's true. I think some people actually have a problem facing an experience that makes them question the violence they're inflicting upon the people they're inflicting it upon. Now, I'm not some person who has like some problem with violent video games. That's not all I'm saying here. I'm just saying that the representation of violence in video games has been relatively one-sided for quite some time now. Although I'd like to point out that in recent years especially, I think more and more studios are experimenting with making the player feel a certain way when it comes to violence. Let's grab the saw, man, because these dudes are clearly... Yeah, that guy's up here. Lugo, you gotta go take this guy up. Game has a little bit of a command system. It's nothing intricate or detailed. Again, much of the gameplay components feel very light and sort of just kind of, I won't say tacked on, but not fully implemented or executed. Likely because, again, they didn't want any of the game to be taking away from the narrative. And I think they got a little bit obsessed with that to some extent. Got 6 shots left on this thing? Do you get more than 6 shots? The ammo counter gets really weird with the heavy arms in this game sometimes. So, you know, we're talking about sales numbers, right? Could a game like this sell better now than it sold back then? I want to say, yeah. I feel like people are more open to this style of narrative. I think the gameplay still needed to be stronger, first and foremost, to get people in. But I don't think we live in a time when people are as afraid to experience a game like this as people make it out to be. Every time I see someone talk about Spec Ops The Line, it's just like, people don't want to have, you know, their morals like test. They don't want to make these brutal decisions. But you look at a game like The Walking Dead by Telltale, It's entirely about making awful decisions, many of which, you know, you have very little say in. They go to hell either way. You know, like it's. So I feel like people do want to play stuff like that. People are willing to play stuff like that. Will it sell the numbers that Take-Two probably wants it to sell, considering the absurd expectations of publishers in the modern era? Probably not, especially considering how well Grand Theft Auto has done for them. But I think games like this need to happen. I'm glad that Jaeger made it. I know they went through a hell of a lot to make it. In fact, they've talked frequently about how difficult the experience was as a whole, you know, from the writing and getting into the mindset to just the fact that the game ended up selling so poorly, the fact that they had to bring another studio on so they could tack on some shoddy multiplayer, which didn't even need to be there because this was very much the era of your game better have multiplayer. I'm surprised BioShock didn't have multiplayer when it came out, because that's how ingrained that mentality really was, unfortunately. All right, let's make our way up here. We'll get a little bit more going in here. I've always felt this game was pretty well paced, though, in terms of how it does deliver that narrative. Because, as I mentioned, we start out, things are kind of just casual, and we're dealing with the sand. This is the perfect time to have an RPG and a sniper rifle. Absolute sarcasm, by the way. It's a good thing after one shot I get to fall down to cover. I should have dropped the sniper rifle a long time ago. And as you progress through, you know, you start to deal with the current threats we're dealing with, right? Like everything going on with the fact that we're just murdering endless hordes of the 33rd. Fellow soldiers. They're beating me in the back of the head. Guys wearing red berets. They're murdering civilians. And at the same time, we're progressing towards that point where everyone starts to break down mentally. Each and every one of the characters that we're currently looking at in the game is going to start to lose their freaking mind and succumb to the madness that seems to have already overcome so many of the soldiers here in Dubai, you know, the 33rd. And the story just gets more and more insane, but always remains coherent later on. And that to me is a really powerful piece of game design, of storytelling design within a game. I think this game is an incredibly well done example of how powerful story is. You know, so many people are willing to sort of throw the story away. They'll obsess over gameplay. And gameplay is important, but when we talk about single-player shooters especially, or campaign-driven shooters, story-driven shooters, having good writers, man. Writers who can really make the player feel something, who can connect the game design decisions that the developer's making with a narrative, with a dialogue, are simply invaluable. You know, I've always talked about professional writers for high-end projects like this, and really recognizing how powerful a writer is, giving them more credit. And this is like sort of that end result, you know? You have a game that is really lacking in terms of its gameplay component, but that brings it home in terms of its overarching design, the music choices, the way in which the sort of chaos and the mystery is portrayed to the player through all of it, and then just drives it home with that narrative and the decisions the player is forced to make. It's the perfect sort of recipe with just a little bit less salt than it needed. And that salt, the lack of salt being the lack of not really polish, but I guess you could say the lack of innovation or the lack of direction for the gameplay. Just chuck your grenade over there. There's just so many little things in the game that you just know were kind of put there to make it fit in line with more traditional shooters at the time, which is why I really do stress the whole idea that a game like this would have done so much better now. I think we're just so much more open to new ideas in our shooters, and we've seen a lot of games just able to have greater success with some more interesting ideas, especially when it comes to narrative, than we ever saw in 2012. That's not to say that 2012 didn't have some amazing stuff, you know, and wasn't pushing out some interesting games. I just think if you were coming across as a military first-person shooter, people had certain expectations, and if you defied those expectations, even if it was for the better in terms of the narrative, people didn't care. They were still upset, which is disappointing. But I think we're going to go ahead and call it there, guys. I could play this game pretty much all day. It would be a long playthrough, so we won't do that. It is still one of those games that I absolutely recommend you check out, considering how dirt cheap it is now. If you're just looking to sit down and experience something that really makes you feel something that shooters don't traditionally make you feel, this game is all that and a bit more as you start to get towards the end of the experience. It's also Actually relatively replayable. You know, if you want to go back and get all of the different endings, if you're that type of person, this game I think is actually worth it because each ending is incredibly unique, or at least unique enough to make it worth experiencing all 4 of them. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Spec Ops The Line 2012. Make sure you go ahead and cast your vote for next week's video. I've got 3 more games up on the annotation in the top right corner of the screen. Just click that little I button, cast your vote. Spec Ops The Line won by a long shot, so I've got a couple of the games that were in last week's vote now thrown into this week's vote. Let me know what we're going to play next Monday, and I will see you guys then.